Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below, and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in, and let's begin. The rope burns on her wrists told a story of struggle that made Gabriel Moreau's blood run cold as he knelt beside the wagon where Sheriff Beaumont's daughter had been left like a sacrificial offering to the merciless Arizona desert. Her unconscious form barely stirring as the morning sun began its relentless assault on anyone foolish enough to be caught in the open without water or shelter. Céleste Beaumont's auburn hair was matted with dried blood that had flowed from a gash above her left temple, while her torn blue dress revealed bruises that spoke of violence that exceeded simple kidnapping into territory involving systematic torture designed to break spirits as well as bodies. The sign nailed to the wagon's side was written in letters that looked like they had been carved with hatred itself. The crude wooden placard bearing words that made Gabriel's jaw clench with recognition of a message meant for men like him who had spent their lives trying to escape the shadows of past mistakes. Outlaw Justice. The paint was still wet enough to smear when he touched it, indicating that whoever had left this gruesome display had done so recently, probably during the pre-dawn hours when decent folks were sleeping and evil could work its will without witnesses to interfere with plans that had been months in the making. Gabriel's approach to the bound woman was cautious, despite his burning desire to help her, as 15 years of riding alone had taught him that scenes like this were often bait for traps set by enemies who knew exactly which strings to pull to make honorable men abandon caution in favor of heroic gestures that usually ended with bullets in the back from hidden rifles. His weathered hands shook as he cut the ropes that bound her to the wagon wheel, not from fear, but from rage that was building like a thunderstorm in his chest, as he recognized the professional precision of knots that had been tied by someone who understood exactly how much pressure human joints could endure before breaking permanently. The water from his canteen brought her around slowly, her green eyes opening with the kind of confused terror that came from waking up in a nightmare that was unfortunately real, while her first attempt to speak produced only a croak that revealed how long she had been without water in desert heat that could kill strong men in hours. When recognition dawned in her eyes and she whispered his name with a mixture of relief and disbelief, Gabriel felt something twist in his chest that had nothing to do with the bullet scar that ached whenever storms were coming. As he realized that fate had brought him face to face with the one person in the world who knew exactly why someone might want to deliver outlaw justice to a man who had spent 10 years trying to forget who he used to be. The sound of approaching hoofbeats from multiple directions sent ice through his veins as he realized that rescue had turned into trap, while Celeste's whispered warning that "they're coming back" was accompanied by tears that spoke of horrors she had witnessed during her captivity that were worse than anything the physical evidence suggested. When dust clouds appeared on 3 different horizons, Gabriel understood that his past had finally caught up with him in the form of men whose patience with his continued existence had been exhausted, while the woman he had once loved more than life itself had been used as bait to draw him into killing ground where 10 years of running would finally end in blood and justice that law couldn't provide, but vengeance certainly could. The bank robbery in Silver Creek had been Gabriel's last job with the Delacroix gang, a desperate attempt to accumulate enough money to buy passage to California where he could disappear into honest work and leave behind the violent reputation that was slowly destroying whatever remained of his soul after 5 years of riding with men whose idea of justice was measured in bullets and whose respect was earned through willingness to kill anyone who stood between them and easy money. The plan had been simple. Get in, take what they needed, and get out without firing a shot that might alert territorial marshals whose pursuit would make escape impossible through terrain that favored organized law enforcement over scattered outlaws. Everything had gone wrong when Armand Delacroix decided that leaving witnesses was a luxury they couldn't afford. His sudden decision to execute bank employees and customers, transforming routine robbery into massacre that Gabriel's conscience couldn't tolerate despite years of moral compromise that had brought him to that moment. The confrontation that erupted between former partners was brief and decisive. With Gabriel's faster draw and deeper commitment to preventing innocent deaths resulting in Delacroix's body bleeding out on the bank floor while sirens wailed and angry voices gathered outside buildings that had become crime scenes rather than simple business establishments. The escape that followed was accomplished alone and on foot after his horse had been shot during the shootout that had ended his criminal career as violently as it had begun, while pursuit by surviving gang members and territorial law enforcement created twin pressures that made survival dependent on speed and cunning rather than firepower or territorial knowledge that could provide advantages in familiar country. The manhunt that was organized by Sheriff Beaumont was systematic and relentless, driven by community outrage over civilian casualties that had turned routine law enforcement into personal crusade for justice that would either result in capture or death for everyone involved in Silver Creek Massacre. The love affair that had been developing between Gabriel and Céleste during the months before the robbery had been conducted in secret due to her father's understandable opposition to his daughter's romantic interest in a man whose reputation for violence was balanced only by his obvious affection for someone whose innocence and beauty had awakened feelings he thought were permanently dead. Their clandestine meetings had been filled with conversations about futures that seemed impossible given his criminal past and her social position. While her belief that love could transform anyone willing to change had provided hope that redemption might be possible for someone whose mistakes had created enemies throughout 3 territories. The letter that Gabriel had left for Céleste on the night of his escape explained his decision to disappear from her life, rather than subject her to dangers that association with wanted criminals inevitably created, while his promise to return when he had found legal ways to clear his name and build the kind of future she deserved was written with tears that had surprised him with their intensity. The 10 years that had passed since that terrible night had been spent in manual labor and honest work that barely provided subsistence living, but which had slowly rebuilt his self-respect, while also creating skills and relationships that legitimate society valued more than shooting ability or willingness to commit crimes for money that was never worth the moral cost of earning it through violence against innocent people. Sheriff Henry Beaumont's transformation from respected lawman to obsessed hunter had begun the morning after the Silver Creek Massacre, when the bodies of 6 innocent civilians were carried from the bank that had been robbed by men whose greed had escalated into murder that shocked a community accustomed to frontier violence but unprepared for the kind of systematic brutality that professional criminals could inflict on people whose only mistake was being in the wrong place when evil decided to collect debts that society owed to those who had chosen darkness over light. The funeral that was held for the victims created community solidarity that demanded justice, regardless of cost or time, required to track down everyone responsible for crimes that exceeded normal frontier lawlessness. The investigation that Beaumont conducted with territorial marshals revealed the scope of Delacroix gang operations throughout 3 states, while evidence of their systematic criminality provided legal justification for pursuit that exceeded normal law enforcement procedures into territory involving federal cooperation and military resources that civilian authorities typically couldn't access without congressional authorization. The wanted posters that were distributed throughout Western territories included detailed descriptions of surviving gang members whose capture was essential for preventing future crimes that could destroy additional communities whose prosperity depended on security that law enforcement provided against organized criminal enterprises. The obsession that gradually consumed Beaumont's professional and personal life was fueled by his recognition that Gabriel Moreau's escape represented failure of justice that made mockery of legal institutions and community values that depended on consequences for criminal behavior, while his survival also created ongoing threats to public safety that could result in additional violence against innocent people whose protection was the primary responsibility of elected officials, whose authority derived from citizen trust in their competence and commitment. The resources that were devoted to manhunt operations exceeded anything previous territorial investigations had required, involving cooperation between multiple jurisdictions and federal agencies whose interest in preventing organized crime was balanced by concerns about costs and jurisdictional complications. The personal cost that relentless pursuit extracted from Beaumont's family relationships was evident in his wife's growing concern about her husband's mental health and his daughter's increasing isolation from a father whose attention was focused on enemies rather than family members whose emotional needs were being sacrificed to professional obligations that had become personal vendettas. Celeste's attempts to understand her father's driving need for justice were complicated by her secret knowledge of Gabriel's character and her belief that 10 years of honest living should provide opportunities for redemption that rigid law enforcement couldn't accommodate without flexibility that personal experience suggested was justified despite legal precedents that demanded punishment regardless of subsequent behavior or genuine remorse. The breakthrough that finally provided leads on Gabriel's location came through informants whose cooperation was purchased through legal immunity and financial rewards that created networks of surveillance throughout territories where wanted criminals might attempt to establish new identities, while modern communication systems allowed coordination of investigation activities that could track individual movements across vast distances that had previously provided security through anonymity. When reports began reaching Beaumont's office about a quiet ranch hand whose description matched Gabriel Moreau's physical characteristics and whose behavior suggested someone with secrets to hide, the sheriff understood that 10 years of patient investigation were finally approaching resolution that would either result in justice or tragedy, depending on choices that would be made by men whose past mistakes had created present confrontation. Celeste's clandestine correspondence with Gabriel during the first 5 years after his disappearance had been conducted through intermediaries whose discretion was essential for preventing her father from discovering communications that could have resulted in immediate arrest and prosecution of the man she loved despite community pressure and family expectations that demanded complete rejection of criminal associations that threatened social standing and personal safety. The letters that were exchanged through careful networks revealed Gabriel's genuine transformation from violent outlaw to honest worker whose commitment to redemption was demonstrated through actions rather than words, while his detailed accounts of legitimate employment and community service provided evidence that change was possible for people whose mistakes didn't define their essential character. The decision to end their correspondence had been Gabriel's rather than hers. Motivated by his recognition that continued contact with Sheriff's daughter could create dangers for her family that his love couldn't justify despite emotional pain that separation caused for both of them, while his final letter had included specific instructions for emergency contact methods that could be used if circumstances ever required immediate communication about matters involving life and death. The 5 years of silence that followed had been filled with Celeste's attempts to build normal life through courtship and social activities that were expected of young women whose futures depended on advantageous marriages to men whose social position and financial resources could provide security and respectability. The engagement that had been announced 6 months earlier was to Marcus Whitman, a successful merchant whose business interests throughout territorial Arizona had created wealth and political influence that Sheriff Beaumont considered appropriate matches for his daughter's intelligence and beauty, while the prospective groom's obvious affection and commitment to her welfare seemed to provide emotional foundation for happiness that practical considerations alone couldn't guarantee. The wedding that was planned for autumn would have established social connections and financial security that frontier life rarely provided for women whose options were limited by economic circumstances and cultural expectations that emphasized marriage as primary avenue for female advancement and protection. The doubts that had been growing in Celeste's mind about her engagement were based on recognition that comfort and security weren't adequate substitutes for the kind of passionate love she had experienced with Gabriel, while Marcus's conventional attitudes and limited imagination made their conversations feel hollow compared to discussions about literature, philosophy, and social justice that had characterized her relationship with someone whose criminal past hadn't prevented him from developing intellectual curiosity and moral sensitivity that formal education often failed to provide. The guilt that accompanied these comparisons was intensified by her recognition that Gabriel's influence had shaped her expectations about relationships and personal fulfillment in ways that made accepting lesser alternatives seem like betrayal of her own principles and emotional needs. The kidnapping that had interrupted her engagement party was accomplished by men whose knowledge of her daily routines and personal relationships suggested surveillance that had been conducted over extended periods, while their specific mention of Gabriel's name during her captivity had revealed that her abduction was connected to her father's manhunt, rather than random criminal activity or attempts to influence territorial politics through violence against law enforcement families. When her captors had explained that she was bait for trap that would finally deliver justice to outlaw whose survival had been mocking legitimate authority for 10 years, Celeste had understood that her secret love had become public knowledge that could destroy everything her father had worked to build, while also eliminating any hope that Gabriel might survive confrontation with enemies whose patience had been exhausted by his continued freedom. The abandoned mining camp where Celeste had been held during 3 days of captivity was chosen for its strategic advantages that included clear lines of sight across approaching terrain, while also providing defensive positions that could be held by small numbers of men against superior forces, while its location in disputed territory between Arizona and New Mexico created jurisdictional complications that might prevent immediate law enforcement response if shooting started and federal intervention became necessary to restore order. The buildings that remained from failed mining operations provided shelter and concealment while also offering multiple escape routes through tunnel systems that connected with natural cave networks extending throughout the mountainous region. The men who had organized Gabriel's capture were former members of the Delacroix gang, whose loyalty to their dead leader exceeded their concerns about legal consequences or moral considerations that might have prevented other criminals from pursuing vengeance against someone whose betrayal had resulted in their leader's death and the destruction of criminal enterprise that had provided profitable employment for people whose skills were limited to violence and intimidation. Their planning had been meticulous and patient, involving months of investigation and surveillance that had finally located Gabriel despite his careful attempts to remain invisible to people whose resources included connections with territorial law enforcement and criminal networks throughout Western territories. The leader of the revenge operation was Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, Delacroix's younger brother, whose desire for vengeance had been intensified by family honor and personal grief that made Gabriel's continued existence an insult to memory that demanded satisfaction through methods that law couldn't provide, but which justice certainly required. His reputation for systematic brutality had been established through years of criminal activity that exceeded even his brother's willingness to inflict suffering on innocent people, while his intelligence and organizational capabilities had made him successor to gang leadership that continued operating despite territorial law enforcement efforts to eliminate organized crime through prosecution and prevention. The message that was sent to Gabriel through channels that his former criminal associates were known to monitor included specific details about Celeste's location and condition, while also providing deadline for his arrival that would prevent negotiation or attempts to involve law enforcement in rescue operations that could result in her death if federal authorities attempted to resolve situation through conventional methods. The terms that were offered were simple and non-negotiable. Gabriel's life in exchange for her freedom, while any attempt to involve outside assistance would result in immediate execution of hostage, whose death would be blamed on his selfishness and unwillingness to accept responsibility for past actions that had created present crisis. The psychological pressure that was created by forcing Gabriel to choose between personal survival and protecting someone he loved was designed to ensure that honor would overcome rational self-preservation, while also providing emotional satisfaction to people whose desire for revenge exceeded practical considerations about consequences that killing Sheriff's daughter might create for their own survival and freedom. When scouts reported that Solitary Rider was approaching mining camp from direction that suggested acceptance of terms rather than attempt to organize rescue operation, Rousseau understood that 10 years of patient planning were about to achieve resolution that would provide satisfaction that legal justice couldn't deliver through conventional prosecution and punishment that ignored emotional needs of people whose losses couldn't be restored through monetary compensation or prison sentences. Gabriel's approach to the mining camp was conducted with all the skill that 15 years of frontier survival had taught him about moving through hostile territory where detection would mean death. While his reconnaissance of defensive positions and guard routines revealed tactical situation that favored defenders whose numbers and advantageous terrain made direct assault suicidal for single attacker whose only advantages were desperation and intimate knowledge of the woman whose rescue justified risks that rational thought would have rejected as impossible. The equipment that he carried included weapons and supplies that had been accumulated through careful preparation and assistance from friends whose loyalty transcended their fears about consequences of helping wanted fugitive, whose survival depended on their willingness to violate law for sake of friendship and moral obligation. The diversionary explosion that announced his assault was timed to coincide with guard change that would create maximum confusion while also providing cover for movement toward building where Céleste was being held. While secondary charges that had been planted throughout the camp created additional chaos that prevented coordinated response from defenders whose tactical preparations hadn't anticipated attack by someone whose knowledge of explosives exceeded anything they had expected from ranch hand, whose reputation was based on gunfighting rather than military engineering. The gunfire that erupted as guards recovered from initial surprise demonstrated their professional competence while also revealing that Gabriel was facing opponents whose skills matched his own, despite numerical disadvantages that made survival dependent on speed and accuracy rather than sustained combat. The rescue itself was accomplished through combination of violence and stealth that utilized every lesson Gabriel had learned during years of honest work that had included occasional cooperation with law enforcement officials whose appreciation for his reformed character had provided training in techniques that criminal experience alone couldn't have taught him. The moment when he cut Celeste's bonds and saw recognition dawn in her eyes created emotional impact that made 10 years of loneliness seem worthwhile, while also providing motivation for completing escape that would require fighting through opponents whose determination to prevent his survival exceeded anything personal revenge usually motivated in people whose hatred was based on abstract principles rather than intimate emotional connections. The running battle that followed their initial escape from the building was conducted through terrain that Gabriel had scouted carefully, but which defenders knew equally well, creating tactical situation where superior numbers gradually offset advantages that surprise and determination had provided during opening phases of confrontation. The wound that Gabriel sustained while protecting Céleste from rifle fire that would have killed her demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice personal safety for her welfare while also reducing his mobility and combat effectiveness at precisely the moment when maximum capability was essential for survival against opponents whose rage was making them increasingly careless about personal safety in pursuit of vengeance that had consumed their lives for 10 years. The horse that Gabriel had positioned for emergency escape was wounded by rifle fire that prevented rapid departure from combat zone, while pursuit by mounted opponents whose fresh animals and knowledge of local geography provided advantages that could result in capture or death for fugitives whose survival depended on reaching territorial boundary, where federal law enforcement might provide protection if territorial authorities could be convinced that jurisdiction required intervention by higher authorities. When Céleste realized that their escape was failing and that Gabriel's wound was more serious than he was admitting, her decision to suggest desperate alternative that might save his life would test whether love was stronger than pride in someone whose self-respect had been rebuilt through 10 years of honest living. The federal marshal who appeared at precisely the right moment to prevent Gabriel's recapture was Thomas Harrison, an old friend whose respect for character and personal transformation had survived a knowledge of criminal past while also providing official protection that territorial law enforcement couldn't challenge without federal approval and jurisdictional authority that exceeded their normal investigative procedures. Harrison's presence wasn't accidental, but rather result of careful planning that had been triggered by emergency communication from Céleste, whose message had reached federal authorities through channels that her father's position had made available despite his opposition to any assistance that might help Gabriel escape justice that 10 years of manhunting had been designed to achieve. The explanation that Harrison provided about federal interest in Gabriel's case revealed ongoing investigation of territorial corruption that had been protecting organized crime through bribery and intimidation of local officials whose cooperation was essential for successful prosecution of criminal enterprises that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities. Gabriel's testimony about gang operations and territorial law enforcement corruption could provide evidence that federal prosecutors needed for eliminating criminal networks, while also establishing precedents for federal intervention in territorial governance when local authorities were compromised by financial or political pressure that prevented effective law enforcement. The immunity that was offered in exchange for cooperation included complete federal protection and legal absolution for past crimes whose prosecution would be suspended pending successful completion of assistance that could result in convictions of criminals whose activities threatened territorial development and federal authority throughout Western regions, where organized crime was challenging constitutional government through systematic corruption of elected officials and law enforcement agencies. The proposal that was outlined by Harrison included relocation assistance and identity protection that could provide genuine fresh start for someone whose cooperation with federal investigation would eliminate both criminal pursuit and legal prosecution. The reunion between Gabriel and Céleste that federal protection made possible was conducted under guard arrangements that prevented interference from territorial authorities while also ensuring security against criminal retaliation that cooperation with federal investigation would certainly provoke from surviving gang members whose freedom depended on eliminating witnesses whose testimony could result in prosecutions that would destroy their criminal enterprise. The conversation that revealed 10 years of separation and mutual longing created emotional foundation for future relationship, while also establishing practical framework for cooperation that could benefit everyone involved in situation that had grown beyond personal considerations into matters affecting territorial governance and federal law enforcement. The decision that Gabriel reached about federal cooperation was influenced by recognition that his love for Céleste could finally be expressed openly if legal obstacles were removed through testimony that would serve broader purposes of justice, while also providing personal redemption that honest work alone couldn't achieve without official recognition that transformation was genuine and permanent. When he agreed to provide federal testimony in exchange for immunity and protection, Both Celeste and Harrison understood that 10 years of running were ending while new chapter was beginning that could provide happiness and security that had seemed impossible when criminal past created insurmountable barriers to legitimate future and family relationships. The federal courthouse in Phoenix became the stage for testimony that would determine not only Gabriel's future, but also the fate of criminal networks, whose operations had corrupted territorial governance, while terrorizing honest citizens whose safety depended on law enforcement that served justice rather than criminal interests that purchased protection through bribery and intimidation. The evidence that Gabriel provided about gang operations included detailed knowledge of crimes, personnel, and methods that federal prosecutors needed for building cases that could withstand legal challenges, while also providing foundation for systematic elimination of organized crime throughout territories where constitutional government was threatened by corruption and violence. The cross-examination that defense attorneys conducted was designed to discredit Gabriel's testimony through emphasis on his criminal past and questions about reliability of witnesses whose motivation for cooperation might include personal gain rather than genuine commitment to justice. While their attempts to portray him as unreformed criminal, seeking to escape punishment through false testimony, created courtroom drama that tested his character and commitment to truth, regardless of personal consequences that honesty might create for his future and relationship with people whose trust was essential for rebuilding life that crimes had destroyed. The protection that federal marshals provided during trial proceedings was necessary due to assassination attempts by remaining gang members whose freedom depended on preventing testimony that could result in prosecutions leading to death sentences or life imprisonment for crimes that exceeded normal territorial lawlessness. While security measures that were implemented included safe house arrangements and armed escorts that demonstrated federal commitment to protecting witnesses whose cooperation was essential for successful prosecution of cases that could eliminate organized crime throughout Western territories where constitutional government was under systematic assault. The revelation that emerged during testimony about Sheriff Beaumont's cooperation with federal investigation created family crisis that tested relationships between father and daughter whose opposing loyalties reflected broader community divisions about justice and redemption that 10 years of manhunting had created, while recognition that personal vendetta had been transformed into legitimate law enforcement operation provided opportunities for reconciliation between men whose mutual respect had been destroyed by circumstances that federal intervention could finally resolve through legal rather than violent means. The verdict that was delivered after months of testimony established legal precedents for federal prosecution of territorial corruption, while also providing personal vindication for Gabriel, whose cooperation had demonstrated genuine transformation from criminal to contributing citizen whose testimony had served justice despite personal risks that could have resulted in death or permanent exile from community relationships and family connections that redemption required for completion of character development that honest work had begun, but which legal recognition was necessary to finish completely. The meeting between Gabriel and Sheriff Beaumont was arranged by federal authorities whose mediation services were designed to resolve personal conflicts that could interfere with ongoing investigation and prosecution activities, while the conversation that took place in Harrison's office provided opportunities for honest discussion about past mistakes and present realities that 10 years of separation and mutual hostility had prevented despite underlying respect that both men possessed for law enforcement and community safety, that their conflict had been threatening through personal vendetta that exceeded rational law enforcement procedures. The apology that Gabriel offered for civilian casualties during Silver Creek robbery was accepted with understanding that moral responsibility had motivated his confrontation with Delacroix, while also acknowledging that past mistakes couldn't be completely erased through subsequent good behavior, despite genuine remorse and systematic efforts at redemption that had been demonstrated through decades of honest work and community service. that character witnesses had documented for federal authorities, whose evaluation included comprehensive investigation of his transformation from criminal to contributing citizen. The recognition that Beaumont expressed for Gabriel's cooperation with federal investigation was balanced by his admission that personal obsession had prevented objective evaluation of evidence suggesting genuine character change, while his acknowledgement that daughter's happiness was more important than professional pride created foundation for family reconciliation that could benefit everyone whose lives had been affected by conflict, that federal intervention had finally resolved through legal rather than violent means. The handshake that concluded their meeting was witnessed by federal authorities whose mediation had prevented tragedy, while also establishing precedent for resolving similar conflicts through dialogue rather than confrontation. The wedding that was planned to unite Gabriel and Céleste received Sheriff Beaumont's blessing along with federal protection that ensured security against remaining criminal elements whose opposition to Gabriel's testimony had created ongoing threats that required law enforcement resources for maintaining safety of family, whose happiness had been achieved through cooperation with federal investigation rather than individual action that might have resulted in tragedy for everyone involved in situation that had grown beyond personal considerations into matters affecting territorial governance and constitutional law enforcement. The community acceptance that gradually developed as Gabriel's federal cooperation became public knowledge demonstrated frontier appreciation for justice and redemption that exceeded rigid law enforcement, while also recognizing practical benefits that his testimony had provided for eliminating organized crime that had been threatening community safety and economic development throughout territories where honest citizens deserve protection from criminals whose violence exceeded normal frontier lawlessness and required federal intervention for successful prosecution and permanent elimination. The retaliation that was organized by surviving criminal networks exceeded anything federal authorities had anticipated, involving systematic terrorism designed to intimidate witnesses while also discrediting federal law enforcement through spectacular failures that could prevent future cooperation from communities whose support was essential for successful prosecution of organized crime throughout territories where constitutional government required citizen participation for maintaining legitimate authority against criminal organizations whose resources included corrupt officials and professional killers. The attacks that were launched against federal facilities and personnel demonstrated criminal desperation, while also revealing capabilities that exceeded normal territorial lawlessness into areas involving military-style operations that required federal military response for adequate protection of civilian populations. The assassination attempt against Gabriel was prevented only through intelligence warning from federal surveillance networks whose sources within criminal organizations had detected planning for elimination operations that would remove key witnesses while sending messages to other potential cooperators about consequences of testifying against people whose power exceeded legal authority through corruption and violence that territorial law enforcement couldn't counter without federal assistance and military resources. The security measures that were implemented for protecting Gabriel and his family required federal safe house arrangements that provided safety while also isolating them from community relationships that were essential for normal life and personal happiness. The escalation that followed failed assassination attempt included systematic attacks on federal law enforcement personnel and facilities throughout territorial Arizona, while simultaneous operations in neighboring territories demonstrated coordination that exceeded anything previous criminal activity had achieved through cooperation between organizations whose individual capabilities were being multiplied through alliance that threatened federal authority and constitutional government throughout Western regions where organized crime was challenging democratic institutions through violence and corruption that exceeded local law enforcement capabilities for resistance or prevention. The federal response that was authorized by Washington authorities included military intervention and martial law, that provided legal framework for protecting constitutional government against domestic enemies whose activities had exceeded normal criminal behavior into territory involving insurrection and treason that required military rather than civilian law enforcement for successful suppression and elimination. The troops that were deployed throughout territorial Arizona were veterans whose experience with hostile populations had been gained through Civil War service and frontier campaigns that prepared them for dealing with organized resistance from criminal armies whose capabilities exceeded normal law enforcement preparation. The community division that resulted from federal military intervention reflected broader tensions about territorial development and federal authority that had been building throughout Western regions where local interests often conflicted with national policies. While the presence of federal troops created opportunities for ending criminal terrorism, while also raising questions about constitutional limits on federal power and military involvement in civilian law enforcement that peacetime conditions normally prohibited, except during national emergencies that threatened democratic institutions and required extraordinary measures for preserving constitutional government against domestic enemies whose power exceeded civilian authority. The systematic campaign that federal forces launched against criminal strongholds was coordinated through intelligence networks that included cooperation from reformed criminals whose knowledge of gang operations provided tactical advantages that conventional law enforcement couldn't achieve through normal investigation procedures. While military expertise that was applied to civilian law enforcement problems created strategic capabilities that could eliminate organized crime through methods that exceeded territorial authority, but which federal emergency powers made legally permissible for protecting constitutional government against domestic insurrection that threatened democratic institutions throughout Western territories. The siege of criminal headquarters in the Superstition Mountains required military engineering and artillery support that civilian law enforcement didn't possess, while the combat that erupted when cornered criminals chose resistance over surrender demonstrated their desperation and military capabilities that exceeded anything territorial crime had previously involved through systematic organization and professional equipment that suggested external support from sources whose identity and motivation required federal investigation that could reveal threats to national security as well as territorial law enforcement. The casualties that resulted from military operations created political pressure for rapid resolution that would minimize loss of life while achieving elimination of criminal networks. The breakthrough that changed everything came when captured criminals revealed connections between territorial crime and international smuggling operations that were using American territories for trafficking activities that violated federal law, while also providing funding for criminal armies whose capabilities threatened federal authority throughout Western regions, where constitutional government required military protection against organized opposition that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities. The evidence that was gathered through military operations provided foundation for international investigation that could eliminate criminal networks operating across national boundaries. The intelligence that emerged from prisoner interrogations revealed scope of criminal conspiracy that exceeded anything federal authorities had imagined possible, involving coordination between domestic criminals and foreign agents whose activities threatened national security, while also providing explanation for resources and capabilities that territorial crime had been demonstrating through operations that exceeded normal criminal organization and required external support for achieving effectiveness that challenged federal authority. The international implications that were uncovered through military investigation required diplomatic intervention and cooperation with foreign governments whose own interests were threatened by criminal activities operating from American territories. The victory that was achieved through military intervention eliminated immediate threats, while also establishing precedents for federal authority over territorial governance, when criminal organizations challenged constitutional government through systematic violence and corruption that exceeded local law enforcement capabilities. But the long-term implications of military involvement in civilian law enforcement created constitutional questions about federal power and democratic governance that would influence American political development for generations, whose freedom would be determined by precedents established through crisis that tested constitutional limits and democratic institutions against threats that exceeded normal civilian authority and required extraordinary measures for preserving democratic government. The investigation that followed military victory revealed criminal networks that extended across international boundaries, involving cooperation between American territorial gangs and Mexican cartels, whose smuggling operations were providing funding and weapons for criminal armies that threatened federal authority while also serving foreign interests that sought to destabilize American territorial development through systematic violence and corruption that could prevent successful democratic governance in regions where constitutional law was still being established through federal oversight and territorial administration that required civilian cooperation and law enforcement effectiveness for maintaining legitimate authority. The diplomatic crisis that developed when evidence revealed Mexican government involvement in criminal operations required presidential intervention and international negotiations that exceeded territorial law enforcement while also creating opportunities for broader resolution of border security issues that had been affecting American development throughout southwestern territories, where criminal activity had been protected through corruption that reached into foreign government offices and military commands whose cooperation with criminal organizations served political purposes that exceeded simple financial gain through illegal smuggling and trafficking operations. The federal response that was coordinated through multiple agencies included customs enforcement and border security measures that required military support for achieving effectiveness against criminal organizations whose resources and international connections exceeded anything domestic law enforcement could counter through normal procedures. While diplomatic pressure on foreign governments whose cooperation was essential for eliminating criminal networks created opportunities for international treaties and agreements that could prevent future development of similar threats to American territorial security and constitutional government throughout Western regions where federal authority was still being established. The trials that were conducted for captured criminals included international defendants whose prosecution required cooperation between American federal courts and foreign judicial systems. While the evidence that was presented revealed scope of criminal conspiracy that had been threatening not only American territorial development, but also Mexican stability and security through activities that served interests of criminal organizations rather than legitimate governments whose authority was being challenged by forces that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities and required international cooperation for successful elimination and prevention of future development. The sentences that were imposed on convicted criminals included death penalties for treason and international conspiracy. While diplomatic agreements that were negotiated with foreign governments provided framework for preventing future criminal cooperation across international boundaries through enhanced border security and intelligence sharing that could detect and eliminate criminal networks before they achieved capabilities that threatened governmental authority and democratic institutions that constitutional government required for maintaining legitimate authority over territorial populations whose cooperation was essential for successful democratic development. The safe house where Gabriel and Céleste were protected during trials and military operations became temporary home where their relationship could develop without external pressure or criminal threats that had been preventing normal courtship and family planning that 10 years of separation had made precious beyond anything either had imagined possible when criminal past and family opposition had seemed to create insurmountable obstacles to happiness and security, that legal recognition of his redemption had finally made possible through federal cooperation and witness protection that provided safety while testimony was completed. The wedding that was conducted under federal protection was attended by law enforcement personnel and federal officials whose presence provided security while also demonstrating government recognition of Gabriel's transformation and contribution to justice that had exceeded anything normal witness cooperation typically achieved through assistance that had eliminated criminal networks and established precedents for federal law enforcement that could prevent future development of organized crime throughout territorial regions, where constitutional government required citizen cooperation for maintaining democratic institutions and legitimate authority over populations whose freedom depended on effective law enforcement. The honeymoon that federal authorities arranged was conducted in secure locations that provided privacy while maintaining protection against remaining criminal elements whose elimination hadn't been completed, despite military operations and federal prosecution that had destroyed major criminal organizations, but which couldn't eliminate every individual whose desire for revenge exceeded rational consideration of consequences that retaliation might create for their own survival and freedom. The time that was spent in federal protection allowed relationship development that had been interrupted by 10 years of separation and crisis situations that had prevented normal courtship activities. The home that was established through federal relocation assistance provided genuine fresh start in community where Gabriel's past wasn't known and his current character could be evaluated through direct observation rather than reputation, that had been created through criminal activities that genuine redemption had transformed into foundation for understanding mercy and second chances that democratic society could provide for people whose mistakes didn't define their essential character when genuine transformation had been demonstrated through actions rather than words that anyone could speak without meaning. The announcement of Celeste's pregnancy created joy that exceeded anything either had expected when their reunion had seemed impossible due to legal obstacles and criminal threats, that federal intervention had finally resolved through cooperation that had served justice while also providing personal happiness that their sacrifice and courage had earned through willingness to risk everything for principles that exceeded personal safety and individual concerns about consequences that testifying against criminal organizations might create for their own survival and freedom from prosecution that immunity agreements had provided. The community where federal authorities had relocated Gabriel and Celeste was carefully chosen for its distance from territorial Arizona and its reputation for accepting newcomers without excessive curiosity about past circumstances that might have brought settlers to seek fresh starts in regions where character was judged through current behavior rather than previous mistakes that everyone was assumed to possess in some form or another. While the economic opportunities that were available through legitimate work provided foundation for building honest prosperity that could support family life and community participation without dependence on government assistance or special protection. The business that Gabriel established through federal financial assistance was designed to utilize skills that had been developed through 10 years of honest work, while also providing employment for community members whose cooperation was essential for successful integration into social fabric, that acceptance required through demonstration of commitment to community welfare rather than individual advancement, that excluded responsibility for neighbor relationships and civic participation that democratic society required from citizens whose freedom was balanced by obligations to serve common good through personal contribution to community, prosperity, and security. The reputation that developed through honest business practices and community service exceeded anything Gabriel had imagined possible when criminal past had seemed to create permanent barriers to social acceptance and legitimate success. While recognition that redemption was genuine and permanent came through direct observation of character that had been transformed through genuine commitment to principles that exceeded personal gain or individual advantage in favor of community welfare and family responsibility that democratic citizenship required for maintaining social stability and economic prosperity that benefited everyone willing to participate through honest work and civic cooperation. The friendship that was established with local law enforcement personnel was based on mutual respect and recognition that Gabriel's experience with criminal organizations provided valuable knowledge for preventing similar problems in their community, while his willingness to assist with law enforcement activities demonstrated commitment to justice and public safety that exceeded legal obligations and showed genuine transformation from criminal to contributing citizen whose expertise could benefit community security without requiring official position or special authority that his past would have made inappropriate despite evidence of genuine character change. The church that welcomed their family provided spiritual community that supported their marriage and approaching parenthood, while also demonstrating that redemption was possible through divine grace and human forgiveness that exceeded legal justice in providing opportunities for genuine transformation and community acceptance that criminal prosecution alone couldn't achieve without recognition that people could change when provided with appropriate support and encouragement for character development that served community welfare as well as individual happiness and spiritual growth that democratic society required for maintaining moral foundation. The birth of their son created joy that exceeded anything either Gabriel or Céleste had imagined possible when their reunion had seemed impossible due to legal obstacles and criminal threats that federal intervention had resolved through cooperation that had served justice while providing personal happiness that their courage and sacrifice had earned through willingness to risk everything for principles that exceeded personal safety and individual concerns about consequences that testifying against organized crime might create for family welfare and community relationships that were essential for normal life and personal fulfillment that everyone deserved, regardless of past mistakes. The naming ceremony that was conducted in their new church was attended by community members whose acceptance had been earned through demonstration of character and commitment to community welfare, while the blessing that was pronounced over their child included prayers for future that could be built on foundation of redemption and second chances that democratic society could provide when genuine transformation had been proven through actions that served justice and community good rather than personal advantage or individual gain, that excluded responsibility for neighbor welfare and civic participation that citizenship required. The letter that arrived from Sheriff Beaumont contained grandfather's blessing and invitation to visit Arizona when federal authorities determined that security concerns no longer required protective isolation from territorial communities where criminal retaliation might threaten family safety. While his expression of pride in Gabriel's courage and contribution to justice demonstrated that personal reconciliation had been achieved through recognition that character could be transformed when people possessed genuine commitment to principles that exceeded past mistakes and current circumstances that might limit opportunities for demonstrating change through service to community welfare and family responsibility. The federal recognition that was provided through presidential commendation acknowledged Gabriel's contribution to law enforcement and territorial security that had exceeded anything normal witness cooperation typically achieved through assistance that had eliminated organized crime while establishing precedents for federal intervention that could protect constitutional government against domestic enemies whose activities threatened democratic institutions throughout Western territories where citizen cooperation was essential for maintaining legitimate authority and effective law enforcement that served community welfare rather than individual or organizational interests that excluded public good. The future that was being planned included educational opportunities for their children and continued community service that could demonstrate ongoing commitment to principles that had motivated cooperation with federal investigation. While business expansion that was being considered would create employment for community members whose prosperity was connected with family success through economic relationships that served mutual benefit rather than individual advantage, that excluded neighbor welfare from consideration of business decisions that affected community development and social stability that democratic society required for maintaining prosperity and security. The warning that reached Gabriel through federal intelligence networks carried news that made his blood run cold. Jean-Baptiste Rousseau had escaped federal custody during prisoner transport. While his first priority would certainly be eliminating the witness whose testimony had destroyed criminal empire and resulted in death sentences for associates whose execution had been postponed pending appeals, that legal technicalities had prolonged beyond anything justice typically permitted for people whose crimes exceeded normal criminal behavior into territory involving treason and conspiracy against constitutional government that required swift punishment for deterring similar activities by other criminal organizations that threatened democratic institutions. The security measures that were immediately implemented by federal authorities included around-the-clock protection for Gabriel's family, while also establishing surveillance networks that could detect Rousseau's approach to communities where relocated witnesses were living under assumed identities that federal witness protection programs had created for ensuring safety against criminal retaliation that successful prosecution inevitably provoked from surviving gang members whose freedom depended on eliminating testimony that could result in additional prosecutions and convictions that would complete destruction of criminal organizations through systematic legal action that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities. The psychological pressure that was created by renewed threats was intensified by recognition that their infant son was now potential target for criminals whose desire for revenge exceeded rational consideration of consequences that violence against federal witnesses and their families would create for their own survival and freedom. While Céleste's fears about family safety were balanced by her determination not to allow criminal intimidation to destroy happiness and security that had been achieved through sacrifice and courage that justice had rewarded with legal recognition of Gabriel's redemption and transformation from criminal to contributing citizen whose cooperation had served community welfare. The investigation that was launched to locate Rousseau revealed scope of criminal network that had survived federal prosecutions and military intervention, involving associates whose loyalty to dead gang leaders exceeded their concerns about legal consequences or personal safety, while their resources included corrupt officials and foreign connections that provided capabilities for systematic retaliation against federal witnesses whose testimony had threatened criminal operations throughout international networks that had been coordinating illegal activities across territorial boundaries for purposes that exceeded simple profit and included political objectives that threatened national security as well as individual safety. The federal response that was organized for protecting Gabriel's family while hunting escaped criminal included military resources and intelligence capabilities that exceeded normal law enforcement while also requiring cooperation with international agencies whose own interests were threatened by criminal activities that had been operating across national boundaries through networks that served foreign political objectives as well as individual criminal gain that required systematic elimination for protecting democratic institutions and territorial security throughout regions where constitutional government was still being established through federal oversight and citizen cooperation that was essential for maintaining legitimate authority against criminal organizations whose power exceeded local law enforcement capabilities. The tracking operation that was organized to locate Rousseau utilized every resource that federal law enforcement possessed, including military surveillance technology and intelligence networks that had been developed through international cooperation for combating criminal organizations whose activities threatened national security as well as individual safety. While the manhunt that was coordinated across multiple territories required unprecedented cooperation between civilian and military authorities whose combined capabilities could eliminate threats that exceeded normal law enforcement capacity for dealing with professional criminals whose resources included foreign support and sophisticated equipment that challenged federal authority through systematic violence and terrorism. The breakthrough that finally provided Rousseau's location came through intelligence sources whose cooperation had been purchased through immunity agreements and federal protection that exceeded normal witness assistance programs. While the information that was gathered revealed criminal planning for spectacular terrorism that would eliminate federal witnesses while also demonstrating criminal capability for challenging federal authority through violence that could destabilize territorial governance and discourage future cooperation with law enforcement from communities whose safety depended on federal protection against organized crime that exceeded local law enforcement capabilities for prevention or suppression. The tactical situation that federal forces faced when Rousseau was finally cornered exceeded anything normal law enforcement had prepared for, involving opponents whose military training and sophisticated equipment required specialized response teams whose capabilities had been developed through military service and anti-terrorism training that civilian law enforcement typically didn't possess without federal assistance and coordination that could provide necessary resources for dealing with criminals whose capabilities exceeded normal criminal organization through foreign support and professional military training that had been acquired through international criminal networks. The final confrontation that erupted when federal forces attempted to arrest Rousseau involved combat that exceeded anything territorial law enforcement had previously encountered, as military-trained criminals whose desperation had eliminated rational consideration of survival possibilities chose resistance that would result in death rather than capture that would lead to execution through federal prosecution that had already demonstrated effectiveness against criminal organizations whose leaders had been eliminated through legal rather than violent means. The shooting that ended Rousseau's criminal career also eliminated last major threat to Gabriel's family safety while completing destruction of criminal network that had been threatening federal authority. The victory that was achieved through systematic federal law enforcement operation demonstrated government capability for protecting witnesses and eliminating criminal threats that exceeded local authority. While the precedents that were established through successful prosecution and military intervention created framework for future federal response to organized crime that threatened constitutional government and territorial security throughout regions where democratic institutions required federal protection against domestic enemies whose power exceeded civilian law enforcement capabilities for resistance or elimination through normal legal procedures that peaceful society preferred, but which criminal violence sometimes made inadequate for protecting community welfare and individual safety. The trials that concluded federal prosecution of surviving criminal organization members established legal precedents for protecting constitutional government against domestic enemies whose activities had exceeded normal criminal behavior into territory involving treason and international conspiracy that threatened national security as well as territorial stability, while the sentences that were imposed demonstrated federal commitment to eliminating organized crime through systematic legal action that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities, but which constitutional emergency powers had made legally permissible for protecting democratic institutions against threats that required extraordinary measures for successful suppression and permanent elimination. The recognition that Gabriel received through congressional commendation acknowledged contribution to federal law enforcement that had exceeded anything normal witness cooperation typically achieved through assistance that had eliminated international criminal networks while establishing precedents for citizen cooperation with federal authorities that could prevent future development of organized crime throughout territorial regions where constitutional government required community support for maintaining legitimate authority and effective law enforcement that served public welfare rather than private interests that excluded community good from consideration of business activities and political decisions. The peace that was finally achieved through elimination of criminal threats allowed Gabriel's family to emerge from federal protection into normal community life where their safety was ensured through law enforcement effectiveness rather than special security measures that had been necessary during criminal prosecution and manhunt operations that had tested federal capabilities while also demonstrating government commitment to protecting citizens whose cooperation with justice exceeded normal civic obligations and required special recognition for service to community welfare that had endangered personal safety and family security for sake of principles that exceeded individual concerns. The memorial that was erected to honor everyone who had died during struggle against organized crime included recognition of law enforcement personnel and civilian victims whose sacrifice had been necessary for achieving victory that protected constitutional government and territorial security against domestic enemies whose power had exceeded anything previous. Criminal activity had achieved through corruption and violence that threatened democratic institutions throughout Western territories, where federal authority was essential for maintaining legitimate government and citizen safety against criminal organizations whose capabilities exceeded local law enforcement. The legislation that was enacted following successful elimination of organized crime created permanent legal framework for federal intervention when territorial authorities were compromised by criminal corruption, or when organized crime achieved capabilities that threatened constitutional government. While environmental and civil rights protections that were established through federal oversight prevented future corporate exploitation and criminal activity that could destabilize territorial governance and threaten citizen welfare through systematic violation of constitutional rights and democratic principles that required federal protection for successful maintenance in regions where local authority was inadequate for resisting organized opposition. The business expansion that Gabriel undertook with federal assistance created employment opportunities for community members whose prosperity was connected with family success through economic relationships that demonstrated how individual achievement could serve community welfare when motivated by principles that exceeded personal gain in favor of neighbor relationships and civic responsibility that democratic citizenship required for maintaining social stability and economic development, that benefited everyone willing to participate through honest work and cooperative effort that excluded criminal activity and corruption from consideration of legitimate advancement. The school that was established through community cooperation provided educational opportunities for children whose futures would be shaped by values that emphasized service to community good rather than individual advantage, that excluded neighbor welfare from consideration of personal decisions. While curriculum that was developed included character education and civic responsibility that could prevent future development of criminal attitudes and behavior patterns that had threatened community safety and democratic institutions through systematic violation of law and constitutional principles that required citizen commitment for successful maintenance and protection. The church that had welcomed their family continued providing spiritual foundation for community relationships that transcended individual differences and past mistakes through recognition that redemption was possible when genuine transformation had been demonstrated through actions that served community welfare rather than personal interests. While religious education that was provided for their children included moral instruction that could prevent future criminal activity through character development that emphasized service to others rather than self-centered behavior that excluded community responsibility from consideration of individual choices and personal advancement. The friendships that had developed through community participation demonstrated that social acceptance was possible when character had been proven through consistent behavior that served neighbor welfare and community good rather than individual advantage that excluded civic responsibility from consideration of personal decisions. While recognition that people could change when provided with appropriate opportunities and encouragement created foundation for democratic society that valued second chances and genuine redemption over rigid judgment that excluded possibility for character transformation through grace and human forgiveness that exceeded legal justice. The happiness that Gabriel and Céleste found together exceeded anything either had imagined possible when their love had seemed impossible due to criminal past and family opposition that had created barriers to relationship development. While their success in building family and community life demonstrated that democratic society could provide opportunities for genuine fresh starts when people possessed commitment to principles that served community welfare and constitutional government rather than individual gain, that excluded neighbor relationships and civic participation from consideration of personal achievement and family prosperity. 20 years after that terrible morning when Gabriel had found Celeste tied to a wagon with a sign proclaiming Outlaw Justice, he stood on the porch of their prosperous ranch watching grandchildren play in gardens that had been created through honest work and community cooperation, while the peace that surrounded their family life provided daily evidence that redemption was genuine and permanent when people possessed commitment to principles that exceeded personal advantage in favor of service to community welfare and constitutional government that protected individual freedom through democratic institutions and citizen cooperation. The monument that had been erected in the town square honored everyone who had contributed to eliminating organized crime and establishing federal protection for constitutional government throughout territorial regions where democratic institutions had been threatened by criminal corruption and violence that exceeded local law enforcement capabilities. While Gabriel's name was included among federal law enforcement heroes whose sacrifice and courage had protected citizen safety and community welfare against domestic enemies, whose power had required extraordinary measures for successful elimination and permanent prevention of future development. The university that had been established through federal funding and community support was graduating students whose education included study of Gabriel's transformation and contribution to justice as example of redemption that democratic society could provide when genuine character change had been demonstrated through actions that served community good rather than individual interests. While research that was being conducted included investigation of criminal prevention and rehabilitation methods that could reduce future development of organized crime through addressing social and economic conditions that created opportunities for criminal recruitment and organization. The Federal Law Enforcement Academy that had been created through congressional legislation included training programs that utilized Gabriel's experience and knowledge for educating future agents whose effectiveness against organized crime would be enhanced through understanding of criminal methods and psychology that had been gained through personal transformation from criminal to law enforcement cooperator whose testimony had established precedents for witness protection and federal intervention that could eliminate criminal threats to constitutional government and territorial security throughout regions where democratic institutions required federal support. The legacy that would endure for generations included legal precedents for federal protection of constitutional government against organized crime, educational institutions that could prevent criminal development through character education and community service, and family traditions that emphasized redemption and second chances as fundamental principles of democratic society that valued human transformation over rigid judgment, that excluded possibility for genuine change through grace and forgiveness, that exceeded legal justice while maintaining community safety and constitutional protection for everyone whose freedom depended on citizen cooperation with federal authorities, whose effectiveness required community support for maintaining legitimate government against domestic enemies, whose power could threaten democratic institutions unless systematic resistance and legal prosecution eliminated criminal organizations through constitutional means that preserved democratic values while protecting community welfare and individual safety. As sunset painted their valley in colors that reminded them daily of beauty that could be achieved through honest work and loving relationships, Gabriel and Celeste understood that their story had become part of American legend about redemption and second chances that would inspire future generations to choose service over selfishness, courage over comfort, and love over fear in territories where freedom flourished, because people had learned that true justice rode not with guns, but with hearts large enough to forgive while remaining strong enough to protect what was right.